Hi class and welcome to lecture 5. Today we're going to be talking about media, bias, and public opinion. Unlike other lectures, this is going to be just one part. It's not really long enough of a lecture to justify 2 or 3 parts. So we're going to start by defining the term political socialization, because I think it's important to understand this process when we're talking about media and politics. So we're going to define political socialization as the process by which a person forms his or her ideas about politics. And at least theoretically, this should be a never-ending process. As you grow as a person, your ideas, not just about politics, but about life in general, should be changing and growing as you obtain and process new information. And especially when you're in college, right? You're being presented with a lot of new information, and it makes sense that your perspective should constantly be changing. And I say theoretically because, as we know, some people can be very stubborn and refuse to change their minds, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. But I encourage you to not be that person. Never be afraid to admit you're wrong, right? Admitting we're wrong, we grow as people, and that is true in politics as well. And that is the process of political socialization. And it should be, again, a never-ending process, but we know that people tend to be more malleable during childhood, meaning they say children are like a sponge, right? They're soaking up everything around them. So political ideals at a young age really change how you see the political landscape even into adulthood. Most people end up identifying as the same political party as their parents. Now, obviously, not everybody, but into adulthood, that is often the case. Not always, but often. So we might want to ask ourselves, we already determined that your parents can have a big influence on your political ideologies, whether you're liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat, whatever it might be. Who else are the main influencers of your political socialization, you growing politically? And I think it's really anyone you spend a lot of time with, right? Your family, your school, hopefully classes like this and your other classes, your friends. And the topic of today's lecture, which is the media. Media, certainly, I think we'd all agree, media can affect how we see the news, the political news, and therefore how we embrace the political world and political news itself. So when we're talking about news media, we can break up the news into 3 different roles, 3 things they seek to accomplish. That is the media as a watchdog, the media as a means to clarify the positions of different candidates, and the media as a means to keep the public informed, the most basic role, perhaps. So let's go through these, starting with the watchdog role of the media. The media traditionally monitors the conduct of government officials. Okay, so if a government official messes up, or they're doing something perhaps illegal, or they're getting into something they shouldn't, the media is there to expose that. And today that's certainly true. The media is on it constantly because they want to be the one to break the story. It wasn't always like that. The media used to sometimes cover for the president or cover for certain government officials. Those days are long gone. 2 great examples, prominent examples of the media acting as a watchdog: the Watergate scandal under President Nixon. Essentially, Nixon was running for re-election and he was spying on the DNC, the Democratic National Convention. They were bugging them so they could pick up their campaign strategies and more effectively beat them. It was discovered by reporters. They investigated it. Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward. And it kept going higher and higher into the government, and eventually implicated Nixon himself. And he had tapes that he had recorded of himself talking about his role in the Watergate scandal. So Nixon actually resigned from the presidency because he knew he was going to be impeached, and probably that impeachment would have been upheld by the Senate. So he actually resigned. So investigative watchdog reporting helped to bring down the president of the United States, the most powerful person in the world. So that's a fantastic example of the media acting as a watchdog. More recently, and some of you might remember this if you're old enough, the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal. They actually are coming out with a TV series on this on FX. I have no idea how it's going to be, but it looks interesting. Basically, Bill Clinton was having an affair with White House intern Monica Lewinsky. and it got out to the news, it leaks, and it became a huge news story. He, of course, initially denied it. He said the famous, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman." And then there was overwhelming evidence that he did. And I'm not going to go any more graphically into that, but you can Google it if you want. And Clinton himself was impeached by the House of Representatives, and then it failed in the Senate. But another example of the new 24-hour news cycle just blowing this up, and it was all anyone could talk about for a long time. I certainly remember that dominating the news when I was much younger. So that's the media's role as a watchdog. The second role of the media traditionally is to clarify the positions of candidates running for office. Just tell us who we're voting for, who we're voting against. What do they support? What do they stand for? Importantly, what did they stand for? And do they still stand for that, right? Do they waver back and forth, or are they consistent with their ideologies? Just general knowledge, character, experience of the individual. So this can be very important, and they can spin this in certain ways when people are running for office. And we know that is very common, right? Certain news outlets, whether they lean left or right, are going to focus on the positives or the negatives of a candidate. And finally, the third and the most basic role of the news is to break news stories. So whether they be emergencies or political news, something stupid, fluff news, whatever it is, what's going on in the world to keep us informed, or whether it's a hurricane off the coast, or president getting in trouble, whatever it is, the news should be there at its most basic function to keep us informed. Now, we're going to classify news, break it up into two categories. First, mainstream news sources, and then alternative news sources. You could probably see where this is going. Today, we're going to call mainstream news sources traditional sources of news, such as TV, newspaper, and radio. And it's funny, we say maybe these are old-fashioned types of news, but these are always changing, right? 70 years ago, radio was the newest thing. That's what people got their news. 50 years ago, TV was 60 years ago, 1950s. TV was the new thing, right? How people got their news. And now we're kind of skewing towards alternative news, but mainstream news still remains important because it has such a broad national audience. People still get their news from television. A lot of people, particularly of older generations, the newer generations, the millennials and Gen Zers are seeking alternative news sources, but many people still do get their news from what we call traditional news sources. So where are people getting the news when they're not getting it from mainstream sources, alternative sources, basically social media, right? From Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, different blogs and podcasts. Let me know if I'm forgetting any there. But I think the main ones would probably be Twitter and Facebook. I'm not sure how in the news Instagram is. And we've seen, of course, that you should know this, a huge uptick in how many people are getting their news from these sources in the 21st century. Here's a chart from Pew Research. It's a little outdated, and I'm guessing the numbers will be a little bit more favoring towards things like Twitter, which is not on here. But I couldn't find a more recent one. Hopefully they'll come up with one soon. You can see different generations, right? You have the millennials, the Gen Xers, and baby boomers. Unfortunately, Gen Zers aren't on here. So baby boomers are those born from mid 40s to mid 60s. Gen X is kind of mid 60s to mid 80s, or even perhaps, mid 80s, let's say. Millennials are from there to about 96, and then Gen Z takes over after that. So you can see the younger the generation, the more likely they are to get their news from social media. Local TV still dominates, at least as of 2014, dominates how baby boomers get their news, traditional news sources, but even Facebook makes an appearance on that. Again, I'm guessing Twitter would be higher on this list now, and maybe Instagram, who knows. But you can see that most older generations get their news from traditional sources, while the younger generations, mostly social media, but still in some ways pay attention to traditional news sources. I'm guessing a lot of those people are getting them on online websites instead of perhaps television or newspapers. So popular has social media become as a way to get our news. We've even seen the presidents of the United States use them. Barack Obama became the first president to use Twitter. Here he is shortly after winning his first election, thanking his constituents for voting him into the presidency. our last president, President Trump. I think we have to talk about him when we have to talk about Twitter, because he was the most, I would say, animated Twitter user, right? Here's a kind of a tame one when he became president of the United States. But it gets unique with President Trump because he also used it as kind of a way, kind of like an online diary, right? Kind of a way to tell people what he was thinking. And he would talk about topical events even. He didn't just focus on kind of fluff pieces, right? Normally politicians, when they post things on social media, it's going to be by their team, right? Or it's going to be something very non-controversial because they don't want to alienate anyone because they need the votes. Donald Trump didn't really take that into consideration. He seemed to tweet whatever was on his mind, sometimes at odd hours of the night even, and he would take hard stances. And I chose this tweet because it was so controversial during the time, the Colin Kaepernick kneeling for the national anthem type thing. And he takes a stand. He said, kneeling is not acceptable, bad ratings, right? So he was very controversial. So my question for you to think about as we go through this lecture and when we answer our questions, do you think this is the new normal? Is using Twitter like this going to be the norm for politicians, or is it unique to Donald Trump? Because I think we could look at it both ways. In some way, perhaps Donald Trump, former President Donald Trump, was unique. He's kind of very bombastic. He's not going to be afraid to let you know what's on his mind. But on the other hand, in some ways it works, right? Because it's free publicity. I mean, Donald Trump would tweet something and it would be on every news station because it was so controversial often. So I could see it being unique to him, but I could also see it becoming more and more of a strategy because, as they say, no publicity is bad publicity. So he was very good at getting his name out there. And controversy will do that. So it'll be interesting to see where it goes from here. So far, Biden hasn't really been using Twitter like this. I doubt he's the one who actually types the tweets or anything. But, as we get maybe younger politicians in office, it'll be interesting to see how they use social media, especially Twitter. So when we talk about news media, it can be a very valuable tool in democracy. And we might even say a necessary tool in democracy because it does the three things we talked about. It keeps us informed, it keeps people in check. But we've seen a switch from kind of this hard-hitting news of taking government officials down and investigative reporting to a lot of really crappy pop culture, dumb BuzzFeed type stories, right? And not to offend you if you like BuzzFeed, but you know what I'm talking about, right? So here's an example of that. And this is actually from CNN. And this is a little old too, but I chose this because it's so ridiculous. So this is from when the Arab Spring Revolution was in full force, right? This is almost 15 years, or well, say 2011, I believe. So this is 10 years ago now. 2011, what was called the Arab Spring Revolution started in Tunisia, spread all over, basically a push for democracy in the region. And Northern Africa had hit Egypt, and essentially there was kind of strikes, people on the street protesting for more democratic practices. What ended up happening, essentially the military took over the country and they dissolved the parliament, and the military remains in charge today. So a huge shift in power in the most powerful country in Northern Africa. And that didn't even make the front headline. The front headline of that day, let's see if I can get the exact date on this. Oh, here it is. February 2011. The front headline on that day, when there was literally an overthrow of the government in Egypt, was that Arcade Fire had beat Lady Gaga for top album of the year. And then if you follow below the fold here, you see military dissolves parliament in like size 10. Now, ignore this stupid little red box. I didn't make this. I found it on the internet. But I think it really shows our priorities, right? There was a literal overthrow of a government in a very important country, and that lost out to Arcade Fire winning top album at the Grammys, okay? So I think we're seeing more and more of this, right? Really important news being trumped by fluff pieces. So, why is that? I think we have to ask ourselves, why does this keep happening? Why do these pop culture dramatic stories keep trumping the important news out there that we should probably be aware of? The answer, it gets viewers. Simple as that, right? If we go back, let's go back to that picture, right? What do we see right to the right of this top story? We see an ad for AT&T Uverse TV and high-speed internet, $69 a month. That's a terrible deal. But, this ad is selling this AT&T Uverse, right? So they know, the people at CNN know, we are more likely to click on the Lady Gaga story than we are on the military dissolving the Egyptian parliament story, right? This sells this. It's all about advertising dollars. So, in some ways, it's like a circle, right? Where does it start? Are they giving us this fluffy garbage news because they know we'll consume it? Or are we consuming this garbage news because they're presenting it to us? And there's no easy answer for that, but it's not going to change unless we as a people start focusing more on the important stuff. If more people read the military dissolves parliament story, I guarantee you that would be the top story. So perhaps it is on us as a culture to pay more attention in the world, to read about what actually matters. Okay, so aside from the news getting, more pop culture drivel, we've also seen content go way down in length, right? So the average soundbite in 1968 was 40 seconds. The average soundbite today is about 8 seconds. That is crazy. And if you don't know, a soundbite is basically like a clip of the video or an audio clip that news anchors will often refer to. So if you're watching the news and they say, oh, President Biden had this to say, and then they'll show a short clip and then go back to the news anchors, that's a soundbite, right? They used to be at an average of 40 seconds. Now they're 8 seconds. What does that tell us? Essentially, news stations don't believe we have the attention span to listen to anything really over 8 seconds. They think we're goldfish, right? And, we're seeing a lot of things being packed into sound bites. And, everyone's on the go. People aren't generally going to sit down and listen to things for a few minutes if it's boring, right? But, you lose a lot when you shorten things. Things get taken out of context, which happens a lot today. You'll see that a lot. Someone will have a paragraph of quotes they said. They'll pick one line and only display that. And that can be a negative effect, right? So we're seeing more and more shortening of the news. So let's switch off here and talk about media and public opinion and how the media can alter how we see the news. So I think that we should start with the fairness doctrine. So it used to be that all news stations had to present equally both sides of the political spectrum. And that was because of the fairness doctrine, which was put into effect by the FCC in 1949. So essentially, let's say you're Fox News, which we know leans right. If they spent 10 minutes talking about a Republican candidate positively, they'd have to do the same for a Democratic candidate, right? You have to show both sides of an issue. That didn't really work out as they had planned, and it was eventually repealed in 1983. There are some people who want to bring this back, though, want to get rid of this obvious bias in many news stations, but it doesn't seem like it's likely to happen. So one way that the media will show their bias, and we're going to talk about a couple different ways here, is by priming, essentially trying to affect public perception of a political leader by making their political party look good or bad. So instead of being obviously biased, let's say someone's very much anti-Joe Biden. They really don't like him. They want to make him look bad. Instead of being completely biased and saying Joe Biden's an idiot, Joe Biden, whatever, they will talk about the policies of Joe Biden and the policies of the Democratic Party and make them look bad. And then, of course, if Joe Biden believes in those policies, he also looks bad. So priming is essentially trying to affect perception to enhance or diminish a candidate or a political leader without directly going at them. It's more of a sneaky way to get people to change their minds about a person. Okay, so news media will do that, and we will see it. And I think you'll notice it when you watch the news all the time. Another way Another way the news will try to influence your way of thinking is through framing, and that is the way they slant a story. So, for example, let's say there's a story and it's pretty neutral, right? It's just a general story, and sometimes there might be one good part of it, one bad part of it. What news outlets will do is they'll cherry pick and only show you the good things if it's a candidate they like or a politician they like. It'll only show you the bad things of someone they do not like. And the example I use here is a good one, I think. Let's go back to 2016. So we already talked about Joe Biden. Let's talk about President Trump. Let's say President Trump reduced welfare programs, made it more strict, but used the money they saved to create food banks for the poor, right? So a liberal outlet, let's say like MSNBC, might say Trump takes money from the poor, not telling the whole story that he took it from welfare and gave it to food banks. Instead, they'll just say, they'll only tell the part where he took it from welfare. That's what we call framing. Framing an issue to show only what you want people to see, even though there's much more to the story. Okay, and it happens on both sides. I'm using examples of Republicans and Democrats, but I want you to understand both liberal and conservative media outlets do this all of the time. It's not unusual. The next way that news outlets try to influence people's thought process is bias by omission, very similar to framing. It is including more sources to support one view over another, right? And you'll notice this in news media when they use phrases like experts believe or observers say or most people believe. What are they doing when they say that? It might be a controversial issue and they say, well, experts believe or most people believe. They're saying if you disagree with this viewpoint, you're going against what the experts say or you're going against what most people believe. So it's a very sneaky way to try to influence people's behavior, right? Or how they interpret information at least, because you're essentially saying, well, if you disagree, you might be an idiot because this is what the experts say. Is that what the experts say? Maybe, right? Maybe it's more controversial, but they're not going to tell you that. Okay. So essentially bias by omission is only providing sources for one side of the argument. So here is a picture, and this is a great literal example of framing, showing how the media can manipulate our viewpoint. So if you look at the picture in the middle, you can see the entire story. Let's say they cut it, and again, this is framing with a picture, so it's quite obvious. They're gonna often do this with written word or on the television, okay? So it won't be this obvious, but let's say they crop the picture to only show you this picture on the right here. What does it look like is happening? It looks like someone's saving someone's life, giving them water. Maybe it's a rescue mission. Who knows, okay? So they might only show you that half and you're gonna get a completely different idea of what's going on. Let's look at the far left now. It looks like this guy's getting assassinated, right? He's getting executed. They're putting a gun to his head. He looks like he's dying or dead and something horrible is about to happen, right? Now, are either of those stories, the left or the right, actually what's going on? I mean, it's hard to tell, right? It's hard to tell. I mean, in the middle, it looks like he's getting water. Maybe they're both dragging him away, but we don't know the context. What we do know, though, is the picture on the left and the picture on the right are not accurate whatsoever. And that's how news networks will frame the media. They're going to show you half the story to further their agenda, and it can be very effective. Okay, so this chart is very interesting. This is also from Pew Research. Now, this is the political spectrum. You should recognize that, from -10 to 10, far right being conservative, far left being liberal. This isn't necessarily where these news stations are on the political spectrum. Rather, this is where people who watch these news stations or consume these news stations consider that news station to be. So, for example, people who watch Fox News consider themselves to be here on the political spectrum. People who tune into Drudge Report or read Drudge Report consider themselves to be a little further right. People who read the New Yorker consider themselves to be pretty left, etc. Okay, so what you'll notice right away is most of these are on the left. So most readers or users of these news stations consider themselves to be on the left. That's generally true. There are more liberal news sources than conservative. But some of the conservative ones are very far right, like Drudge Report. And again, this isn't necessarily where these news stations are, but it's pretty interesting that people who consume Fox News, for example, consider themselves to be pretty moderate Republicans, right? I mean, would you put Fox News there on the political spectrum? Probably not. You probably put it closer to the 10, and Drudge Report might be off the chart, right? It'd be like 30. Same thing with New York Times. They consider themselves to be pretty moderate, or MSNBC, and they probably are further left in reality. So it's interesting to see where people actually consider themselves to be on the spectrum versus where the news stations actually are. So interesting chart. Here's another chart, basically what we just talked about, but in a different format. I'm sorry, no, this is a little different. This is trusted news source, my mistake. This is what news sources are most trusted and least trusted. You can kind of get an idea here. This poll was taken during the Trump administration. So you can see President Trump himself is a source of news on here that wasn't very well trusted. Same with Huffington Post, Rush Limbaugh, who's passed away, Drudge Report, CNN, CBS, all these with the negative are considered not very trusted. Where these on the positive, USA Today, New York Times, going up to things like BBC, NPR, PBS, things that are considered a little bit more neutral. Public television, The Economist are more trusted. So take a look at this chart and see if you agree with these. Do you think that we should be trusting these news sources that they put and not trusting the ones that they put up here? It's interesting to think about. And some of them might be somewhat surprising. Okay, so moving on, when we're talking about media in a democratic system, there is good and bad. That's what we should be taking from this lecture, right? Because in some ways, yes, the media provides, oops, my mistake, sorry. The media provides ways for us to interact with government officials. It promotes transparency. I mean, if an elected official makes a mistake or does something illegal, we know about it, right? Information is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. People have cameras on their phones and are connected to the internet. And that way, I think it's good because it keeps government officials in check. And we can also say that in some ways, media can be harmful to a democratic system because it's constantly chasing sensation and instigating conflict, right? Essentially, because it offers every single person a voice, does it really offer anyone a voice? I think that's what we have to ask ourselves here, right? If everyone has a microphone, can you hear anyone? Or is it just drowned out in a sea of obnoxiousness? Okay, so there are good and bad aspects to our to media and our democratic system. Okay, we're gonna end this lecture here talking about measuring public opinion. So we talked about media and how it can affect public opinion. Now let's say we want to measure that public opinion, see maybe if media is actually affecting it or what's going on, where we can gauge how a candidate's doing in an election, et cetera. How do we do that? We would do that through polling. And I'm sure you all know what polls are. Essentially, you're gauging public opinion. And you could do these through political polls, trying to figure out who's going to win the next election, right? Right now in California, Gavin Newsom is going through a recall. They're trying to kick him out of office. And the polls are changing daily, right? A couple of weeks ago, it was saying that it's about a 50-50 chance on the polls that he might be recalled. Now it's saying, he's up by a double-digit lead. So these things are constantly changing. They're very static. When we're doing polls, there's a couple important terms you need to know. First, sample size. A sample size is simply the number of people surveyed in a poll. Okay, so let's say we have 50 people in your class, all right? And I wanted to determine what my class's favorite ice cream flavor is. The N, or the sample size, would be 50 because there's 50 people in the class, okay? Simply the amount of people surveyed. This is the most important aspect of a poll, and that is random sample versus non-random sample. In order to have an accurate poll, you must have a random sample. That is the most important aspect of creating an accurate poll. Essentially, everyone in the population you're trying to measure must have an equal chance of being chosen for the poll, okay? So let's say I want to run a poll on the United States of America, okay? And I want to know the United States of America's favorite ice cream cone, favorite ice cream flavor. Now, I can't ask all, whatever it is, 340 million people in the United States what their favorite flavor of ice cream is. So I conduct a poll, all right? And I'm going to survey, let's say, 10,000 people, okay? In order to make sure my poll is accurate, I must pick randomly from everyone in the United States, 10,000 people. Everyone must have an equal chance of being chosen. What I do is I put everyone in the United States name in the computer. It would spit out 10,000 random names, and I'd ask them, and I'd survey the results. If it is done randomly, we can say that poll, those 10,000 people chosen, represent the entire country. But it must be a random sample. Everyone has to have an equal chance of being chosen for this poll. Okay, we talked about that. So important to take from this, again, the most important thing about a public opinion poll is making sure that everyone has an equal chance of being chosen. And that means that large sample sizes are not necessarily always more accurate, right? If you don't get a random sample and you're choosing, even if it's 40 million and they're not random, they're just people that you've gotten from a website that maybe aggregates data, it's not necessarily going to be accurate. Which brings us to our next term, margin of error. So the margin of error of a poll is how accurate or how confident you should be in the results, okay? So normally how that's written is you'll see a percentage with a plus or minus. So let's say we run a poll and we get a confidence interval of 95 plus or minus 3. That means if you ran this poll 100 times, 95% out of those 100 times, you would be accurate within three points of the true population. So what I want you to take from this, I know margin of error can get a little confusing, and I don't really need you to know the math. What I want you to take from margin of error is that the lower the margin of error, the more accurate the poll. So you want a margin of error of something like 95 plus or minus 1. That means 95% of the time you're going to be within 1% of the correct what the correct population actually is. So again, what I want you to take from this is lower margin of errors are more accurate, whereas higher margin of errors are less accurate. So that's going to conclude our lecture on the media. Thank you for tuning in, and I will speak to you guys soon.